Good afternoon, everybody, and or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome to another Fireside Chat hosted by the Fubon Center. I'm Arun Sundararajan. I'm a professor at New York University and director of the Fubon Center for Technology, Business, and Innovation. And I'm delighted to have joining me today Markus Herrmann Chen, who is the co-founder and managing director of China Macro Group. I'll be inviting Markus to tell us a bit more about his journey in what follows. But Markus is by far one of the smartest minds about China that I have encountered. His analysis is always data-driven. His frameworks are always illuminating, and his knowledge of how China works sort of exceeds pretty much anyone I know. So I'm really delighted to have Markus joining us. Welcome, Markus.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you very much for having me. And also thanks for everyone who's taking time over lunch to join our fireside chat. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so why don't we dive right in? I mean, I'd love to start with just a brief overview of what you do with China Macro Group and sort of the journey that led you to creating and running this this advisory group. So just sort of give us for a minute or two a sense for how did the China Macro Group come about, and what was the journey that led you there?
Yeah, thanks, Arun, for asking this question. I think it's very important, especially maybe also generally, but especially also in the China field. What is the vantage point of someone? What are the epistemics of someone? What kind of information is someone processing in order to work on China analytically and then also strategically in advising? I would maybe start that the value proposition of CMG is assisting foreign business in making strategic decisions with regards to the Chinese market, Chinese economy, and tying together a set of lenses. One is the policy lens, a market lens, an economic lens, and then also I would say an IR lens that is twofold. It's geoeconomic factors and geopolitical factors. And that's also drawing on my personal background. So first thing is I'm half Chinese, I'm Swiss Chinese. I have a cross-cultural upbringing, and I spent significant time, although growing up in Europe, in Chinese community and learning the Chinese language and then studying in Beijing and working also in China. And the second point on my personal background that relates to the value proposition of CMG, China Macro Group, is that I started off with international economic law and WTO law in Geneva. You could call it geoeconomics today, if you want. And then I spent time with BCG, Boston Consulting Group, to get into the corporate thinking in contrast to the international economic systemic lens. And then I led the government affairs function of Bayer Material Science in China, which was then standing on the side of foreign business, but looking at the policy environment. And in a sense, the CMG is tying together my experience into a consulting value proposition that I'm now serving clients with a great team, a very diverse team that comes from different angles. We talk about multipolarity analytically, not normatively. So we have a Russian colleague, we have a Taiwanese colleague, Chinese colleague, colleagues, of course, and then also someone who used to work in the EEAS, the Foreign Ministry of the European Union. And that's how we want to gather information and process information and debate it on behalf of our clients.
Okay, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that combination of, sort of you understanding the technology and the science, you understanding how companies think, but you also having this sort of broader systemic view and, sort of a nuanced understanding of geopolitics. It's a sort of a very interesting combination. So I think the last time we met was in the snowy peaks of Switzerland. I know that you were just at Davos last week. Did you have a good Davos?
Yeah, we last time met, and you did a very impressive presentation at the World Economic Forum headquarters in Geneva, which I appreciated, which showed also how Fubon Center is tying together policy and business and technology. I was at a sideline event in Davos, which is a very close trip from Zurich. So it's just 3 hours there and then 3 hours back. I was doing a panel discussion on China, but I was very attentively also processing the speech of the most senior Chinese delegation leader, that is the Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang, that was leading this time the delegation to Davos. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to sort of dive into that because, you know, I saw that speech as well. And it really did take me back to 2017, actually. You know, and not the speech given by President Xi at Davos that year, but at the summer Davos that year, there was a speech given by, like, you know, the premier. And Li Keqiang, I think, and you know, where there was sort of this this almost there was this moment of surprise as China announced to the world in 2017 that they were now the bastion of free trade and of like, you know, sort of opening up borders and of a sort of a global world order that was open rather than closed, that they were the champion of, like, you know, sort of pushing against protectionism. And you know, like, you know, if you fast forward 8 years to 2025, that doesn't come as such a surprise anymore. But I think that that was certainly something that I took away. But I'd love to hear your reactions to you know, the vice premier's speech at Davos this year and sort of what you took away from it.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I'll give you some impressions, but at first, because you mentioned 2017 summer Davos, so I assume that has been in June 2017. I just want to mention briefly that 2017 in October was the 19th Party Congress. And the 19th Party Congress introduced a variety of very important concepts that were there, made ready to be reframed, to fully reframing China's development strategy then in 2021 with the pandemic, 1 year into the pandemic. The leadership introduced the term of new era, 新时代. It also changed the principal contradiction, which is the Marxist logic of what are you ultimately trying to solve as an economy that is evolving. And it also the term of high quality development, that together with new era was introduced to mark a change, a step change. But I think the real policymaking that then also showed that change was then executed with the 14th Five-Year Plan in 2021. But what I'm saying is you were actually at a very symbolic moment in summer WEF in 2017, because just a few months later, it was the first time that President Xi was the incumbent leader, so he could actually take more influence on the overall policy trajectory. Ding Xuexiang's speech, so the most senior leader this time in Davos, he spoke about 20 minutes. I was checking quickly. And then he took 2 questions. I think he touched all the interesting topics: international affairs, trade diplomacy, security, economy, green transition, opening up trade, foreign business in China. I would share maybe two things. First, at this point, I think one thing that really was interesting. He mentioned as a new concept. He said that the goal, or China is willing to help third countries, 各国, so he left it open, third countries to build emerging and future industries. And we will come back to that possibly later in China's innovation framework. This is now very clear what future and emerging sectors mean. And he added that China would be willing to help with new type of infrastructure. So you can see it as trade diplomacy, but you can also, more importantly, you can see it kind of as the Belt and Road 2.0, because it's evolving to a next level of not just exporting EPC capacity that can do infrastructure building, but actually that works on emerging and future industries. That's one point. And then the second point is more a reflection about when I was listening to him, because he was giving very genuine assessments on what China is trying to accomplish, especially also in response to Trump. And I'm sure we can go there. Yep. In a moment. But I was just asking myself, how much of his messaging is actually being heard, and how much can be lost in translation, can be lost in the language, can be lost because of trust that has already been lost. So my big question mark about his messaging, because I thought and we can go there. I think he passed on all the right points that China is actually trying to work on that is also in the interest of foreign business. I found that interesting. I don't have a survey of what people thought about it, but realizing the density of Chinese policy debate and thinking and concepts, it's very hard to actually come to a global stage like Davos and then translate that conceptually and communicate basically outside of this universe of Chinese internal debate. And that's my big question mark. And to what extent is it possible? Do you need kind of a third party or an intermediary to actually tell the world what he is saying? But that's just something that I was asking myself, because I still observe among diplomatic circles, but also for foreign business circles, a lot of confusion about what China is doing.
Yeah, and in some ways, I mean, that's a role you play, right? I mean, I think that there's there's a careful parsing of the words that are said by leaders, and an interpretation of that, not just in terms of like, what the words actually mean, but in terms of viewing them through the lens of how leadership thinks in China rather than how Western leadership thinks. And I'm sure we'll sort of come back to that sort of again and again as we go through, the different points that we want to cover. So, sort of diving into sort of more deeply into the Chinese response to Trump 2.0. I mean, I think you've already started to touch on what you see as like, the playbook here, or as like, sort of the 3 or 4 pronged strategic response to like, sort of like, the re-election of President Trump and, all the rhetoric about China, but also in like, the rhetoric of the US sort of pulling back from, this philosophy of like, sort of a multilateral world. And so why don't we go there and like, maybe you can sort of spell out for us, like, what do you see as sort of the core elements of China's strategic response to Trump 2.0?
So I appreciate that you have been framing that my primary lens is to look at how China looks at itself and how Chinese leaders think about itself. I would, in response to Trump, I think it's a very good lens to actually look closer at what China is doing. And on a high level, I would like to lay out just 5 areas where I think China is now responding strategically to Trump, mostly by accelerating existing policy trajectories. But basically with Trump in mind. So let me quickly just lay out these 5 areas. I would say first one is China is accelerating opening up. That's one of the first reactions, and I will want to go into that in more depth. The second one is China is accelerating its reforms of the socialist market economy. The socialist market economy is the concept. It are the framework conditions, if you want, that you're facing in China's economy as a foreign business. It includes multiple pillars that I can also talk about. The third one, I would say, Chinese leaders are also accelerating the innovation work that China is doing, industrial policy. The key term here is new quality productive forces. As a third thing, I would say in terms of diplomacy, and I would like to also open that box if we have enough time to look at that. I would say the high level point here is that China is trying to be very active in any type of pluri and multilateral setting, just for the sake of generating possible future opportunities that can come from more uncertainty that a Trump administration is going to inflict and bring onto the world. So China tactically will stay engaged in everything and try to be there and have a seat there. And then just the fifth one, which has been ongoing, but is also crucial, and it's part of the strategy how China has been actually preparing for this moment of Trump's return to the second presidency, is China's de-risking. So de-risking policy in how China has been dealing with that. I would say overall, if you look at July 2024, so that's last year in summer, that was the most important reform meeting in 11 years. The last reform meeting at that level by the Chinese Communist Party was in 2013. And it was the first meeting where President Xi was presenting to the world some of the reforms that he wanted to conduct.
Okay.
discussing all reform areas that China has that needs to look at was already the election of Donald Trump, because the Chinese side was clear. It's not only just a preference, I would say, from a Chinese leader's perspective, because it creates more opportunities if you are active and try to get them. But it's also what they predicted, basically by looking at fundamentals and all the information that is available to everyone. So that's how they concluded. If I may, I will maybe open the first box, opening up. I think it's a very interesting box. Arun, if I can go there.
Okay, yeah. And then this is China opening up to everyone except the US, right?
Exactly. I would say that the framing is an accelerated opening up to the least developed economies and to everyone more broadly that is non-US. And it's actually very impressive if you look at the policy program that China has been going through since the summer in opening up. There's for instance, there's an example of switching for services, trade services. China switched to a negative governance system. So it means that everything is open unless it's on this negative list. That's a big change. China also completely removed all FDI restrictions on manufacturing. It did it in November 2024. It further expanded the so-called FDI positive list. That's the list where you encourage FDI, and you will also give support if that FDI is coming. Basically conditioned to Chinese interests. China is running multiple opening up pilots for instance, in the telco sector with 4 new pilots. It has allowed the establishment of foreign-owned hospitals in 9 pilot zones, including in Hainan. It has extended visa-free traveling for a certain amount of days, also to many different countries, I think 30 plus countries. And it also unilaterally reduced all tariffs on goods in the meantime, 43 countries, least developed countries, it removed 98% of all tariffs on all goods. And I think that this is just an exemplary, it's not a conclusive list. This is all happening since July 2024, since that reform meeting. So I think the reality is that China is trying to work on its economy when it's actually when it sees Trump also coming with an America first policy and putting America's economy's interest first.
I know it almost seems like it's sort of like, you know, the dialogue and the words that are being used are sort of anti-US rhetoric. It's like, you know, sort of the not against the US, but like, you know, you're taking the rhetoric that is coming out of the federal government in the United States and you're reversing it. I mean, like, you know, one world superpower is saying we're going to raise tariffs. Another world superpower is saying that we are going to lower tariffs or we're going to remove tariffs. I do want to come back to this, and I do want to sort of dive into the reforms of what is still largely a socialist economy. But before we get there, could we get to point 3? Because I suspect that that's the point that you know, we'll end up spending the most time on, and I want to make sure that we do justice to it before we, like, you know, start to get into Q&A. And this is, you know, the point that you raised of, like, you know, sort of the integration of the innovation value chain, right? I mean, this is a you know, this is fascinating, and I've learned a lot from you about this agenda that is underway. So I wonder if you could unpack that for us, and then maybe we'll dive into a couple of specific sectors, you know, sort of generative AI, semiconductors, and so on.
Yes, pleasure to do so. I wanted to quickly just pick up on your point of where you say you have different economies now taking different policies at this point. I think one large transformation I just want to highlight briefly, in Chinese own thinking, it has been the largest so-called strategic shift, 战略转移, in the last 50 years of Chinese policymaking, was to define the so-called dual circulation. And the dual circulation at its core is actually an heightened appreciation of its own domestic market. I think the way China saw itself and framed itself previously was China was on the way heading into the direction of global economy, trying to integrate into global economy and behaving like a world factory. And in 2020, by then you had 1.5 years of trade war that was started in March or June 2018. And you had the COVID pandemic that laid bare a lot of vulnerabilities. You had a complete rethinking where China started to assert its, I would call it jurisdictional interest. So China started to discover itself as being a large domestic market that needs to think about its own interests and how could it behave, or how would it work if you are if you're left alone as an economy. So President Xi, for instance, he coined a term that had never been before. He talked about self-circulation. So China's economy needing to reach the ability of self-circulation. And I think that's the backdrop, and everything we see now, all these reforms, and we can talk about the innovation value chain integration in a moment. I think they're all built on this fundamental idea of the dual circulation of China building its domestic economy. On innovation, I would say the most important thing to watch, and it was created only very recently, it's the so-called new quality productive forces. And the new quality productive forces is an ideological term, if you want, and it tries to explain multiple things. The new quality productive forces are first and foremost a framework of traditional versus emerging versus future industries. And China has defined them. It has defined 8 emerging industries, and it has defined 9 future industries. I'll just give you a couple of examples just to get a sense. And I'll also add that Chinese leaders, we have spoken about that previously, Arun. Chinese leaders are very, very careful about corporate interest capture into the fundamental governance framework that is trying to drive the combination that a country has of traditional, emerging versus future industries. And I would say that Chinese policymakers would say that they have a unique ability to drive, to keep traditional sectors' interest in check, in order to actually allocate resources and attention, policy attention and talent, etc., the whole value chain towards future sectors. And I'll give you a couple of examples of emerging industries, the way Chinese policymakers think about it. And this is all defined. It's all entirely transparent. So you have new gen IT, new energy, new materials, high-end equipment, NEV, green industry, civil aviation, and marine engineering. These are so-called emerging industries. And then if you go to future industries, they are indeed more future. You have the metaverse, brain-computer interface, quantum tech, humanoid, generative AI, a keyword you already dropped, and then biomanufacturing, next-gen display, next-gen network, and next-gen energy storage. And what beyond adding this concept of new quality productive forces, which is there to organize, to provide a top-down view framework on this traditional emerging versus future industries, and also to serve as the highest ranking, I would say, principle that the focus has to be on total factor productivity optimization, which means China's future growth needs to come from tech diffusion and innovation. It cannot come from just using its endowment, cheap labor, or urbanization as more basic ways of increasing your GDP. And then the last component.
That's a really important point, because growth so far has been very resource intensive, right? And this is sort of a fundamental shift towards the less resource intensive, sort of future industries. And so I think that would be, if they pull this off, that would be a very significant shift in China's sort of economic footprint, both sort of domestically and for the world. But I'm sorry, I cut you off. Please.
No. Yeah. I think that's a very good characterization. I would fully agree with that. And the self-assessment of Chinese leaders is that China's industrial base is in its breadth is not strong, and its breadth it's not modern. So it is highly aware that, of course, you have pockets of innovation, but if you look at the entire economy and where China is right now with GDP per capita and the middle income trap and all these challenges looming, you need to have this radical focus on total factor productivity and the new quality productive forces. I would say if you look at the third plenum that I was mentioning July last year, which is this 11 years, so only 11 years later, you convene to discuss what are you actually reforming. I would say the new quality productive forces was one of the 2 most important things besides the opening up, indeed. And maybe the last component I just wanted to briefly mention, and then we can also go into this, is a key concept that is also part of the new quality productive forces, a part of this framework, traditional, emerging, future, and total factor productivity, is the attempt to integrate the innovation value chain. And in Chinese, it's 产学研一体化. 产学研 means academic, corporate, and research, to actually integrate that. And I think the starting position is just that China's self-appreciation of how it has been doing, and a lot of the innovation that has been happening in China over the last years and decades has been led by the corporate sector. It has been led by replicating, learning from other players, by tech transfer. But I think the assessment is that the fundamental research assets that have been built in basic research, they did not spill over. They did not spill over into the execution and commercialization. And we will see very soon, and also a new policy that will be published from what I see in public traces that are indicating that in how this entire value chain, this innovation value chain, including the university sector, how they will be much more aligned to interact with one another. Just give you one example inside the Ministry of Education. It sounds like a simple example, but for if you look at how China has been evolving, it's actually a very interesting example. They just they created a new department, 就业司, an employment department inside the Ministry of Education, because they realized that in order to have maximum elasticity of your supply of talent in view of the market needs, you cannot communicate only intraministerially and leave it to an intra-agency process, but you actually need to have that voice inside of the Ministry of Education yourself that is telling you what kind of talent is needed. Yeah.
But this let's sort of drill a little deeper here, because if you think about how this innovation value chain works in, say, the United States or in other Western economies, it's more free market and venture capital driven, right? I mean, you've got certainly education that is sort of powering ahead on its own. A lot of R&D comes from that. There's government funding of R&D, but again, there is a competitive sort of decentralized free market process. Industrial policy, which has sort of gotten a little more proactive over the Biden administration, but is still pretty light touch. And the idea is that, like, you sort of fund the R&D, you have world-class universities, ideas will emerge, entrepreneurs will pick them up, VCs will fund them. And, so there's no sort of concerted coordination or integration of this innovation value chain, say, in the United States. And what I think I hear you saying is that China wants to, for these future industries, proactively integrate the innovation value chain across the private sector, research, and academia. I mean, do you think that's going to work? I mean, like, are there any examples of it having been done successfully in the past?
Yeah, I think it's great that you open the field to comparison, because indeed, I think although it's shifting, you can operate with a very open science approach, and then you let entrepreneurship and VC funding come in, and they will pick up what they need. And also some, let's say, Western universities, they're very good at managing tech transfers, right? So they will be doing the licensing work and incubate or catalyze also startups out of engineering universities. I think China, to some extent, has a more centralized vision of that, and it also has a more radical self-diagnosis of where it has been failing. Because if China looks at its science-based innovation, it would say that its track record is actually very limited, and all the scientific assets that have been built inside the very large university and Chinese Academy of Science, and that whole ecosystem is actually limited. And I want to give you just two examples of where the reform measures are trying to loop in. Unleashed entrepreneurship or loop in the corporate players. So one example is, and a lot of the things, by the way, that I'm saying are part of a new publication that we have, and it's all on slide. It's very well visualized, and it's maybe more clear than I'm explaining it, but I want to give you just the gist of it. I think it's important. So the two examples I want to give you is there's currently a pilot running inside China with 40 universities, and at the top of those 40 universities, Jiao Tong University in Shanghai. And what they're piloting is actually a change of the concept of research assets belonging to the state, research assets belonging to the state, as opposed to the understanding of the scientific person to co-own that asset or actually to try to sell that asset. So in these pilots, you see a very radically different proprietary notion, which basically in all the research projects you have, you give and fully empower the scientists to go to the market and try to sell that or to license it out. And that's something, it's a fundamental change of where China's research system is coming from. The second example I want to give is private sector companies are now invited, private sector companies, so not state-owned enterprises because they have been involved in this anyway already, but private sector companies are invited to execute so-called R&D projects of national relevance or national significance. I forgot the exact term. So you are saying that from a research perspective, there's a certain technology you want to build, but you are actually relying on the execution capability by looping in, so kind of backward integrating private sector players, as opposed to do it with state-owned enterprises or do it by yourself and then hoping that the research assets will actually move into this to the corporate sector. And I think the underlying idea why it accelerated this integration of the value chain idea, there's a concept of 新型举国体制 in China. It has a de-risking background. So it was also an attempt to do everything in your sphere of influence that is possible to at least try to create those spillovers, also absent a less developed funding market, of course, because the success factors that you were mentioning that are, I would say from the outside, that is driving a lot of success in the United States are the entrepreneurship and the VC funding. And China cannot rely, at least on the funding level, cannot rely on the same type of endowment or maturity that the US has.
Okay, I mean, this is, it's going to be an interesting few years to sort of see if there are particular industries or particular sectors in which this kind of more integrated innovation value chain starts to work. Because in some ways, it runs counter to, well, I'm not sure that it runs completely counter to the US philosophy of innovation. There has been a lot of government-funded innovation in the US that has also, but eventually, the spillover and the economic impact tends to be sort of free market rather than sort of being centrally controlled. If we start to, I'm monitoring, for those of you in the audience, I am also monitoring the questions, and I think 2/3 of the questions so far have been about DeepSeek and what we think of that relative to. And so we'll certainly get to that, don't worry. But before we get to generative AI, I wanted to first start with semiconductors and sort of applying this lens there, because, in many ways, this is, if you think about the focus of overt technological sort of war between the US and China over the last few years, the export restrictions, Biden's sort of agreement with the Netherlands and Japan to prevent the export of, ASML and Tokyo Electron machines to China, in sort of an effort to maintain sort of a greater lead that the US might have in building the highest end semiconductor devices. I mean, ironically, of course, 90% of them are built in Taiwan, but, to sort of, slow China's progress in sort of creating the latest generation of AI chips and other sort of advanced semiconductors that may have other uses. Self-circulation is unlikely to be able to fund an entire semiconductor value chain. And I'm starting from sort of the ASML machines, right? Sort of that's sort of a multi-hundred-billion-dollar company, the hardest thing in the world, I think, the most advanced machine that humanity has ever created. And then you sort of have design, you've got manufacturing, certainly China can compete. But do you see this integration of the innovation value chain in reshaping how China is viewing semiconductors, or do you have any other reactions to, especially since export barriers are likely to go up rather than down from the US? Do you think that there's going to be a change in sort of the relationship with the Netherlands that may sort of open things up for ASML? Do you see China as wanting to sort of create domestic competitor to ASML? I mean, where do you see things going on that semiconductor front? Because I think that it has really been the core, to me at least, like, in my view, of technological competition and open warfare over the last 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, great, Arun. Great question. I think there's a lot of work out there on semiconductors. I will give you a high-level view from our side. We've been mostly working with suppliers in China's ecosystem, foreign suppliers in the semiconductor value chain. On DeepSeek, we can talk about it in a moment. I've been using it for a while to support my research. On a high level, I would say semiconductor chips was already very clearly a priority of Chinese industrial policy since the 13th Five-Year Plan. So that's 2016 to 2020, and 2016 is pre-trade war, but it's post pivot to Asia. So I think there is a causality there, but it's pre-trade war. And I would say I would characterize overall on a high level that in China's industrial policy into 2018 has been self-assessing its effectiveness as being low. And 2018, with the trade war, there was a change. And what we actually see, and I would like to differentiate that, we see actually de-risking policy coming in and trying to support the buildup of indigenous semiconductor capabilities. And de-risking in a Chinese context, just to define it quickly, I would say, because de-risking is fundamentally a European concept, and then Jake Sullivan also used it in a US context, but it fundamentally is the attempt to see where did China had an even higher level of urgency beyond its natural organic development needs. And basically, if you try to find every policy measure that is justified with security, even if it's just rhetorically, it signifies or it indicates another level of urgency. And if you go through all policymaking of China, that's just in a nutshell China's de-risking policy, and you extract everything that is being justified with security, you will land with what we summarized in a report for the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. That's the second largest or second large advocacy organization aside the AmCham. We summarized it into 6 pillars. And there's one, the first one is a self-reliance pillar. The second one is on bottleneck technologies, where you try to accelerate with national scientific programs. You try to find a tupo, a breakthrough. And basically,
would you think of, like, ASML machines as being an example of a bottleneck technology?
Yes. If you're on a high level, I think China's the factual execution so far, if you break it down into materials required, equipment required, and software required, I would say, because China has been severely, it's a severe factor for China to be cut off by ASML machines, which is in the entire value chain of creation of semiconductors is the pinnacle, as you already alluded. I think China's strategy was trying to maximize its equipment base, and it still has a very high reliance on foreign equipment. There are different figures, but there are figures ranging from 15% upwards in how much it can actually already indigenously produce at a higher level. So the strategy of China was to maximize its own equipment base that it is building, and increasingly indigenously, and you actually see it's catching up, it's accelerating the level of indigenous equipment with software. That was the strategy, because if you look at, for instance, Huawei has an arm that is focused, it's the biggest fabless, so without any manufacturing, it's a chip design company. It's Huawei Silicon, and they have been working with SMIC, the largest Chinese fab inside China, and they have been able to deliver a 7 nanometer chip without working with the TSMC, and leveraging old machines, ASML machines, but changing the software and having a less efficient manufacturing process. So China's strategy, I think this bottleneck technology attempt that China has been trying with the de-risking logic did not succeed yet, but it managed to find other factors to combine and to actually catch up. But net, you have a persisting vulnerability of the Chinese system. And whether you also mentioned on whether the Dutch foreign policy stance will change, I don't know, but the backdrop is changing, of course, because you no longer have a Biden administration that is trying to coordinate cross-country industrial policy and aligning tech standards and also normatively charging the technology work. So I don't know to what extent Dutch foreign policy will take a different stance. I think it's clear that ASML would love to be engaged in the Chinese ecosystem to draw on the talent, draw on the data, draw on every resource that is there. But for now, it's a huge challenge.
Market, yeah. No, that's sort of really fascinating. I think that there is, in some ways, there's sort of a repurposing of old technology, and perhaps that's sort of the first step towards sort of replicating the technology in-house. But I think a more likely path forward might be sort of like sort of a reshaping of the relationship with the Netherlands and Japan, which in some ways, as far as U.S. foreign policy is concerned, would be a loss for U.S. foreign policy, sort of like narrowly construed, because one of the greatest assets that the US has is like, sort of the last 75 years of having built these networks and sort of having had like, sort of the European companies in Japan and so on in the network in a way that allows them to sort of coordinate industrial policy. Part of the reason why there are so many questions, and we're sort of soft, we'll enter the Q&A phase in sort of a soft way. In that, like, I'll sort of pull a couple of questions from the Q&A and then I'll weave them into sort of like, the discussion. But I think part of the reason why there are so many questions about DeepSeek is that, although it's been around and visible to us for about a month, today the stock market in the US seems to be reacting. And like,
Okay.
NVIDIA shares are down dramatically, or at least were down dramatically when I last checked, of fears that like, something like DeepSeek, which is a generative AI technology that is performing at a high level, sort of a large language model, so performing at sort of language tasks at a high level, but claims to have been built for like, a few $1 million and like, sort of at 1/10 or 1/30th the sort of compute needs of things like ChatGPT. And so, I think that's the backdrop for a lot of questions about DeepSeek. But if I broaden the lens to your sort of, what you're seeing on the Chinese generative AI front in general, like, I know that there's Kimi, there's DeepSeek. I mean, what do you use? I mean, do you see DeepSeek as sort of the tip of the iceberg of like, sort of Chinese dominance in these future industries that, like, they've outlined, or do you see it as still reliant to some extent on US innovation and open source models like Llama 3 and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I think in discussing about generative AI, I'll do a mix of my subjective experience as a user of this software, and I'll just quickly narrate in how I think it has been evolving, and then also some systemic points. So just on the subjective side, I've been, and you mentioned them, Kimi. I think Kimi is my favorite, DeepSeek, Doubao. There's a multitude. I would say the story from Chinese frontier adopters was that when ChatGPT came out, ChatGPT was very appreciated, but there were already Chinese options. And then in 2023 and then into 2024, I would say that the number of Chinese willing to pay, because you have to pay for ChatGPT for its upgraded versions. I would say that there was increasing pivot towards very viable Chinese options. And then by mid last year and then into the second half of last year, I think this the leaders among Chinese LLM models have become clear, and then they started to grow rapidly. You mentioned the stock market. I did not pay attention to that today. I had a very absorbed day today, but it's very interesting, and maybe you can also share more. But I think from a Chinese perspective, it has been building organically. It was always clear that there is entrepreneurship there, and I would say it's also maybe on the systemic side briefly. There's of course certain factors at play that have been also allowing enabling this the outcome that we're seeing right now. And I cannot technically judge, where they are exactly. Personally, I like Kimi most, but you just need to be aware of of some restrictions like censorship. So if I do my policy research work, the databases of the state of the government are actually more reliable than if you work with generative AI. But there's a lot of use cases that we also, as a research firm, we can already draw on. So on the systemic side, I just think it's of course competition, talent, data, availability of data, but also China put forward 2023 a relatively lax governance framework for generative AI, explicitly for generative AI, which should enable, and that's maybe also what the Trump administration was suggesting with its first actions, which should enable more leeway. And just to quote one data point that I think is interesting. So in China, according to MIT statistics, MIT, the Ministry of Informatization and Industry, it says that there's already 600 million people using Chinese generative AI applications, whereas ChatGPT is, I think it's declaring itself, it's about 300 million users. So you have very early adopting, very broad, and using Chinese generative AI. And I think now DeepSeek coming to the forefront is probably because of course, because of their technology, because of the open access approach. And then I think in the Chinese context, what we also need to be aware of is that DeepSeek has been curated also to meet the premiere just a few days ago. So it's kind of being elevated to that position of how they created it with a relatively young team coming from the university environment, adopting some of these principles that I was mentioning earlier, coming from research and then spinning off and working on their own innovation, that the Chinese government is also endorsing this type of model, which is much more a market-led model in how it came into being. So I think it's exciting times what we can observe. And me myself as a user, I just updated the latest version of Kimi, and I'm looking forward to using it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that there's, this is not a complete surprise. I mean, I think that it has been widely expected that smaller models and less compute-intensive models will start to catch up with, sort of the larger, more compute-intensive models. And, there has been sort of a business model question about, are the sort of like, the tens of billions or like, the hundreds of billions that companies are plowing into data centers and but it does change the landscape on the semiconductor front as well, right? Because if the AI models go in a direction as sort of one of our participants, Kin, points out, to sort of being not just brute force, sort of like more data, sort of more performance, but to sort of having some nuance, having some sort of like other dimensions of AI, like expert systems and so on integrated. This will certainly sort of dramatically change the economics of like, sort of like, what sort of leads to leadership. I'm just sort of browsing through the questions and, there are a couple of questions that aren't so tech related, but are more sort of, about China's economy more broadly. And, because there's sort of this ambitious agenda that is being sort of like, is being put out, according to this sort of like, according to this plan and like, integration of the innovation value chain going after like, these cutting edge industries from generative AI to like, sort of the metaverse and, sort of like self-sufficient semiconductors. But, this is all sort of sitting as like, one of the participants points out with the backdrop of like, the Chinese economy seemingly not being in great shape. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on like, the shorter term economic issues facing the country. And, like another question is, so how do you execute on this sort of this broad plan when the economy is in trouble?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for the segue from technology away. Just one last word I want to mention on DeepSeek is just its open source approach. I think that's I mean, from a vision perspective, it's very interesting, and we just need to pay attention. I fully agree. You can have new quality productive forces, you can de-risking, you can do all these, you can open up. But if your operational economy is actually not working well and driven by a multitude of factors, this is a main focus that you need to pay attention to. I think if I just quickly narrate what I think that in 2024, or where we actually have come from and what we're seeing right now, I think China's economy, so fundamentally, we're in the post-COVID economic recovery stage. It's kind of the recovery. The question is, how fast is the recovery, and how much policy attention is Chinese leaders putting on structural reforms as opposed to monetary and fiscal policy tools and coming into the markets, intervening into the market, because there has been a lot of discussion of distributing coupons and a lot of ideas in how to stimulate domestic demand. I would say China's economy was doing moderately well for the first half of the year last year. And then it was really in summer when the GDP figure plus the core CPI, that's a consumer purchasing index, where it showed that China was at the brink of or falling into a deflationary dynamism or spiral. And then as a result, you also saw in the Politburo last summer basically saying that the insufficient demand is the core issue, and that which was the backdrop for the interventions that have been taken for in September and October. I think the first data that we can see now is that both, if you look on the demand and the supply side, it's the purchasing price index and the consumer price index. We see that there's actually a positive effect. You also see that in the document that I was referring to. So that's the first evidence that some of these market interventions that had been undertaken in September and October, that they are working. At the same time, real estate, which is an important or massively important factor in China's economy, it's about a quarter of the GDP, but of course, it's no longer going to be the future growth driver. We don't see a complete change, but we see a slowing down of the negative trend. We also see that new floor space built as opposed to new floor space purchased. We see actually that the inventory of China's floor space is starting to be consumed, which is a good thing. Which means that you no longer have oversupply and too little demand. So we see not a full reversal of the trend, but definitely a slowdown of the negative dynamics. And now into 2025, I think the NPC, which is going to be on the 4th and 5th March, so in 5 weeks, that's where we will see whether there's new measures adopted. But I would just say the fundamental attitude that Chinese policymakers have is they know it's about psychology at this point. And they will not take out the, I don't like the term, but the term bazooka, to actually come in with these, with much stronger measures. They will try to keep focusing on structural reforms and try to intervene as much as they need step by step. Yeah.
Okay. So we have about 7 minutes left, and there are two things I want to get to really quickly. One is, earlier in the conversation, you had talked about the reform of the economy. Are there any particular predictions you have about, steps that China might take that would be sort of particularly important for people to pay attention to as they go through the process of reforming, what is still, largely a socialist economy?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for circling back. I think that's if you're a foreign business or even if you're an investor, these are fundamental framework conditions. Socialist market economy, it's chapter 6 of the 14th Five-Year Plan. If you extract the dimensions that Chinese government is trying to optimize against, it's about 9 dimensions. It includes IP, it includes social credit. You may have heard about social credit system. It includes SOE reforms and so on. I think the most interesting dimension that also for foreign business that is key to see is Ding Xuexiang, the vice premier, he actually said it in Davos. So I'm very curious whether that was an effective messaging, but he was very clear on that. He said the third plenum last year took a decision at a new type of level to treat different capital forms equally. So foreign capital, state capital, and private capital. Excuse me. And I think this is nothing new as a policy direction, but it has never been as credible as now, because at the same time, a clause that that needs to be officially reiterated in the third plenum, that the public economy has the priority over the non-public economy, was erased. It was deleted, which is very symbolic. And I think the underlying logic is the logic of dual circulation, which says as long as jurisdictionally capital is inside China's economy, why would we discriminate that? Because we used to be in the logic of trying to catch up on a corporate level. We as a Chinese corporation against foreign business, and you also see in industrial policy, the metric of measuring industrial policy until 2018 was market share of Chinese companies against foreign companies. But it has been dropped. And since 2018, I think it's very fundamental that the industrial policy metric that you're measuring against is the market supply capacity. So is the market able to supply, regardless of what capital form you are? And just to give the concrete example here that Ding Xuexiang he also mentioned, is China just put forward the first time a definition of what does it mean to produce in China? What does made in China actually mean? And they will say, if you make something in China and the exact threshold of value creation in China is still to be defined, you will get a 20% discount advantage or discount in a public procurement process. So kind of to put it a bit cynical, China now put a price tag on equal treatment of capital forms under the condition that you localize, which will resonate with a lot of the America First logic. It's really a logic of where you say, as long as you're inside our economy, we will treat you well, and we will also treat you equally. But in China's context, this is a very important change, because you come from a planned economy and then from a very state-orientated economy, and now to basically this claim. So I would say this is the most important reform to watch.
Okay, that's so there are credible signs that China will treat different capital forms equally, not just sort of like, sort of in principle, but in reality. Okay, so I mean, there are so many other questions that we're not going to be able to get to on, sort of you talked about de-risking. We wanted to talk about like, sort of how it's been hedging itself. I mean, people have asked about other particular sectors, drones, and so on. But I wanted to sort of close up by picking up on like, sort of one of the threads that you just sort of raised in like, what you just said. And, we've got sort of this new China in some sense. You've got Trump 2.0. You do have the challenges internally that the Chinese economy is facing. And so, if you were talking to a foreign business, like, sort of looking to China and thinking about doing business with China, how would you, like, what would you advise them? Like, what kind of framework would you, or what kind of lens would you give them to sort of like, approach dealing with China, given the economy, given like, sort of the shift in the innovation value chain, and given like, Trump 2.0?
Yeah. Thanks, Arun, and thank you for shepherding the discussion across all these different dimensions we've touched upon. I would say that if you take the COVID pandemic, which was 3 years of inability of headquarters, travel to China, which ended in 2022, end of 2022. So we have now seen 2 years of interactions between headquarters and their China subsidiaries in both directions, traveling into China, and then also Chinese delegations coming to the headquarters. I would overall characterize the situation against all the backdrop we've been discussing as a challenge of strategic decision-making. And the strategic decision-making, of course, needs innovation on management concepts as well, because you are, since the trade war now into 2025, where we are right now, with geoeconomic factors, geopolitical factors, and a reassertion of let's say the domestic economy, industrial policy, and so on. I think, at least if I think back to my management consulting time, also back in BCG, when I left BCG in 2014, I'm not sure whether all the management concepts are there. So one advice that I would have is, and I would differentiate that by fundamental company type, and how are you involved in China's economy. So there's one type of company that is hardly localized in China. SMEs, hardly localized. They mostly have sales. And then you have SMEs. I'm now in the real economy. And you have SMEs localized. And then you have MNCs, large MNCs. They're also localized. I would say the strategic decisions that each of these companies have to do are very, very, very different. I would say, for instance, an onshore Chinese onshore SME needs to operate like a Chinese company to have the speed. I would say an onshore MNC that is larger needs to really figure out how deep it wants to engage. For instance, we talked about the integration of the value chain. We talked about China's own networks that it's building into third markets. Do you actually see that as an opportunity, and you try to be part of this Sinocentric trade system that is unfolding? Or if you are a non-onshore company, I think that's most difficult. And just in terms of strategies, high level, I would say you kind of have to pick your strategy very clearly now. Either you go on premium innovation, you try growth. If you think that margins are very difficult, especially if you compete against SOEs or you're in a public policy-driven market, you kind of hibernate and you wait because you think in 10 to 20 years or 5 to 15 years, there will be a different setting. Or what I see a lot of companies doing, they try to pivot to a strategy where they try to find group value added through China, which means something that is not measured with profitability or revenues. It can be partnerships, it can be innovation, it can be a new type of consumer insight, etc., etc. So I would say, just to summarize, I would say right now is the challenge for a lot of companies that I see is just to land on strategic decision making with innovative management concepts and agree on which of the strategies is the most suited one, given all the factors in China and internationally.
Okay, I mean, this is always fascinating. I mean, 1 hour is never enough to have a conversation with you, Markus. I mean, this is, I mean, for those of you who are like in the audience, I mean, like, you know, we saw close to 300 people join the Zoom webinar. And so, like, you know, thank you all for joining. Ruby has dropped a link to China Macro into the chat. If you do want to access some of the reports that Markus was talking about, you know, sort of over the course of our conversation. I also do want to invite you, before I forget, to join us for our 8th or 9th annual FinTech conference on February 28th. We have an incredible lineup from New York's top you know, financial regulator, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, like, you know, some phenomenal panels. So it's on Zoom. Join us if you can. But with that, Markus, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our audience. This was, like, you know, hugely informative and educational for me. I hope it was for all of you as well in the audience. And, you know, stay tuned for, like, you know, sort of more exciting events from the Fubon Center. But thank you again, Markus.
Thank you, Arun, for hosting. Thank you, Arun, for taking the time over lunch, and wishing all the best to Fubon Center and the team. Thanks a lot.